Welcome to the Long Thread podcast about spinning, stitching, and weaving by hand. The podcast is presented by Long Thread Media, publishers of Spin-Off, Handwoven, Piecework, and Little Looms magazines. Find us online at longthreadmedia.com. I'm your host, Long Thread Media co-founder Ann Merrow. We've partnered with Brown Sheep Company to bring you the story of their more than 40-year-old family business producing yarn from blending and spinning through dyeing in western Nebraska. Join us for a conversation with Andrew Wells, who grew up in the mill, and his wife Brittany, a talented weaving designer. Andrew Wells, thanks so much for being with me.
Thank you, Ann, for having me.
So in a small business, a job title never really says everything, but how do you describe what you do there at Brown Sheep?
On the corporate documents, I'm the secretary, but that's kind of a loose term. I do a lot of things around here. My job is not just in an office, but I am in charge of most of the production within the mill and the production quality and pretty much anything the mill kind of needs. This is a very small family business. And so I work with my mom and my dad, and we all fill different roles. I work with my wife, Brittany, who fills a very niche role in the design and kind of the creative side. And also my mom does, and my dad and I work on a lot of more of the hands-on things. And then I have two sons. My one son, Walter, decided he knew I was going to be on a podcast and he wanted me to mention him. So this is my plug. Walter's 5. If anybody is familiar with our catalogs over the past couple of years, you'll see my two sons normally on the back cover playing with yarn. So definitely very small and very blessed to be able to work in a place where my family can be very close to me.
You know, and when people talk about a family business, they often think about, one generation passing it to the next. And I've certainly run into your mom and dad a lot. Your mother, Peggy Wells, has been at events from coast to coast. And I've seen you and Brittany and your kids at shows, but it goes further than that, right? How far back does Brown Sheep go?
Yeah. So Brown Sheep Company started 40 plus years ago, but it started even before that. My grandfather, Harlan Brown, and his wife, Janet, my grandparents, my grandfather, in no better terms, was a farmer and raised sheep for a majority of his life. And then 45 years ago, he kind of had a dream of starting a place, not only making a very nice product, but also a product that is using a good that he knew for many years, which was wool, and for the American wool grower to be able to have a place for their wool to go. And that started about 45 years ago. He kind of went back east to the failing textile industry in the South and started buying used equipment, about 4 truckloads of used equipment, built the building kind of on a dream and a hope, and then started making yarn. It took him about 9 months to learn how to make it in a commercial fashion. And it's kind of just spiraled from there. Now we produce, I don't know how many lines of yarn. It changes throughout the years, 10 to 12 with hundreds and hundreds of colors. So the passing on of a family business on my side is not I wouldn't say an easy thing, but anything worth doing is never easy. It's a lot of, especially a business like this, learning and learning and learning. And I'm constantly learning every day.
I was looking through a back issue of Spin-Off, the Spin-Off annual in 1980, and there's a listing in here under product news. Sheep Company starts mill. The Brown Sheep Company of Mitchell, Nebraska has started a spinning mill. They have wools in gray, black, and white, and knitting and weaving yarns for sale. For more information, write the Brown Sheep Company. There it is.
Yeah, it's very fun for me to hear an old ad like that, because one of the family folklore stories was my grandfather on his first kind of sales rep trip across the country. People would look at him and say, "Where do you get your wool? Where do you get your yarn?" They did not believe him that yarn could be spun in western Nebraska, of all places. So he was almost accused of lying at the very beginning. So hearing that ad, which I'd never seen before, which was very much here's the truth, we are actually making yarn, is for me kind of a neat and kind of something that kind of encourages me to keep going.
And what was it about having a mill in Nebraska that people thought was so odd?
So textiles, especially wool textiles, to produce it, you need a certain environment to run machines effectively. And that normally means a lot of humidity. What that helps with is as the wool is running and the fiber is running through the machines, it creates static electricity, and you actually have binds or laps within the machine. And so we're located in western Nebraska, almost to the Wyoming border, and it is very arid here, very dry. And it is, for them, it's hard to believe that we're actually making yarn. I actually still get emails from factories across the seas that say, we will make your yarn for you. And I just ignore the emails normally, but I want to reach out and shake them and say, well, it's done here in western Nebraska.
And it's even more rare now than it was when your grandfather started. I mean, even textiles and yarn manufacturers that existed in the U.S. then have largely dissipated. So not only was it hard then, but, keeping it going now is really kind of a challenge and a treasure.
Yes, definitely. We're definitely a treasure here in the fact that it's all here. It's all close. Every yard of yarn that comes through has been touched by somebody. A lot of people don't realize how labor intensive yarn manufacturing is. A lot of people love to complain about knots in their yarn. And the fact is that's just a part of yarn manufacturing is you have to tie a knot when it breaks. So
have you been working among the machines since you were a small child? That sounds kind of dangerous, but when I think about how it gets passed from one person to the next, you must have grown up around this mill and this mill equipment as well.
Yeah, there's a long backstory to that. Before my parents came back to help my grandparents run the mill, this was late in 1990s. My mom spent about 6 months to a year. We were living in Fort Collins, Colorado, which is about a 2.5 hour drive. And my mom would come over here for a week at a time. And occasionally I would come over because I like my grandparents and the mill, and it's always been in my blood. And I told my mom the story goes, when I was in kindergarten, that I was going to quit school and go right into business. My parents had a different plan for me. They knew I needed to get out and have some other education, of course, but it is very true. And so when we moved over here, I wanted to be a part of this mill from day one. I wanted to work. And so my parents gave me a broom to push. And I wanted to be a part. And so from a very young age, I've been giving a tour of the mill since I've been 12 or 13, continued to give tours and be a part of it all the way through my high school era. And then I went off to college. I continued to come back. And this kind of bridges into the family aspect of this. The company and some other volunteers would actually hold a fiber fair every fall. And no matter where I was in college, I would come back for that weekend to give tours. I'd always look forward to it. And I was in my senior year of college, and I came back, and I would give 2 to 3 tours on a Saturday. And this beautiful girl came through the door with her mom, and I got into giving the tour. And at this time, I had just come back from a college trip called NOLS. NOLS is a National Outdoor Leadership Schools. And I did a semester in Alaska, and we had an instructor that do some crocheting and knitting. So in between the sections, I actually called my mom and said, hey, can you please send me up some yarn and needles? And so she sent me up some yarn and needles, and I got the needles, and we were on a section of mountaineering, and we packed 3 pairs of needles and a couple skeins of yarn in our backpack. And there was a time in which we got snowed into our tents for about 3 days. And we had to find something to do. It was actually not snow, it was rain, which was 10 times worse. And so I would go from tent to tent. There was 4 tents teaching my other students how to knit to pass the time. And so these are some of these stories that were coming out. And my wife loved to knit, and her mom loved to knit, but they also were outdoorsy. And these stories kind of, I would like to say, wooed my wife or captivated my wife. Or now she's my wife. I gave it away. But yeah. She looked me up because I had a name tag through social media, and we exchanged numbers, and we talked for 3 to 4 months. I was living in Laramie, Wyoming, and she was living in Lincoln. And then the rest is history. We were married about a year later. So to say that this business kind of runs through me is kind of an understatement. Yeah. Meeting your wife on a tour of your family business.
And you were going to get to talk to Brittany a little bit later, but I know from talking to your mom that, she loves having Brittany as part of the family, but also if she could have picked out another generation to pass along the business to, Brittany just fits in so perfectly.
Yeah. And my wife and I were talking in the car this weekend, and we were talking about this upcoming podcast, and she was like, oh, and she's the one who got me into doing designing, and we'll find out more about her designing that she's been doing for Little Looms and other things, but I won't spoil that for her.
It's always a pleasure to talk to her.
Yes.
And so the thing about pushing a broom and giving tours is that it's actually, I think, part of a larger story, because educating people about the work you're doing and the importance of it, and how in some ways it's much bigger than people would expect, and in some ways it's much more intimate. But then also pushing a broom, keeping the equipment clean, being able to keep that fuzz from getting everywhere is essential to keeping this whole thing going.
Yeah, I really can't remember life without the mill type of thing, since it's been around here, and understanding how the machines work came later once I kind of moved back and took part of the business and really actually worked.
Yeah.
Like I said before, the learning continues day after day. These machines that we run are all very complicated, even though spinning is very simple. Then also the complications of how to make a good yarn, how to create a consistent yarn, how to make sure all the ends are spun in, and all of these things. Luckily, I've had some good mentors throughout the years, and so a lot of people with a lot of patience.
And it kind of starts with the wool, just like in your family. It starts with sourcing the wool. And can you talk a little bit about the process that something goes through to become a skein of brown sheep yarn?
Yeah, that's a great question. Wool is grown, a majority of it is grown here in the West. And so we have wool growers in Colorado, Wyoming, South Dakota, and North Dakota. This is all my understanding. Sheep get sheared once a year, if you didn't know that. And the distance between their skin and how long that fiber is called a staple length. And once that wool is sheared, it's normally bagged. If anybody's been around a sheep before, you know that they're very smelly. A majority of that is from the natural grease that they produce, lanolin. Most people love lanolin for their hands and for a skincare product, but lanolin from the wool is fairly dirty. Most of that lanolin gets washed out, or we hope all of it gets washed out. And that is done in a wash house. There's a few wash houses, but we get most of our wool washed at a facility in South Carolina. And then after the wool comes here, it's in a long roving type of form. And then as that roving gets to us, it is clean. We buy our wool in grades, not necessarily breeds. So we buy it for how fine that fiber is. And that's measured underneath a microscope, actually. Once it comes to us, it runs through a multitude of machines to comb out that fiber and create a very consistent sliver. A lot of the terms that you hear in yarn manufacturing, they kind of come from the South or from like France, because that's where these machines are made. So when the yarn is going through the machine, it's called a sliver, and it's said in a very Southern way. And then as it goes back to the machine, it's actually called a doubling. And the more times this wool or roving is doubled onto each other, the doublings get doubled on, the more consistent fiber you get. Once that fiber is then combed and drafted, and the word draft just means to pull out the fiber in a manner that it is consistent yard from yard. We want to make sure every yard weighs a certain amount and it's consistent. After it's been, sliver has been created, it goes underneath a spinning frame, and our spinning frames use drafting gears. Drafting gear would be very similar to the fingers of a hand spinner, but just in a much more consistent, controlled way. And then as that's going through the machine, just like a spinning wheel, the twist gets put on as it's leaving the drafting gears, or if you think of it as the spinning wheel as it leaves the fingers of the hand spinner, and then it goes and gets put onto a bobbin. And then at that point, we do all of our dyeing here, which is something that still amazes me, that in Western Nebraska, where water is so scarce, that we are still doing it. It's amazing. We have a dye house that dyes so many different colors, and it is if anybody's familiar with our color lineup, you realize how many different blends or different colors that we have.
Yeah, absolutely. It has to be pretty water sparse in order to keep dyeing in such a dry area. And there are fewer dye houses now than there used to be as well. I mean, there's fewer spinning facilities, fewer dye houses.
Yeah, it's sad to me that I feel like wool is almost a dying breed of media for people to use. It's just, I wish it wasn't, but I don't know, maybe it's our current social economic climate where people are looking at their phones more than they're using their hands. And I'm sure the listeners of this are probably the opposite, but doing things with your hands is just so much more valuable than scrolling through social media.
Well, and I was reading recently that unfortunately the percentage of synthetic fibers versus natural fibers has changed so much.
Yeah, most people, I'm sure you included, don't really ever want to work with synthetic fibers because it's such a tactile experience. No one can really buy wool yarn without feeling it.
And you also have several blends, right? You have some yarn with a little bit of mohair in it, some yarn with a little bit of cotton in it. Do those get blended there in the mill?
Yeah, so I'll take the first one, which is you were mentioned mohair. So lamb's pride is 85% wool, 15% mohair. And that is done in that first process that I was telling you about where the yarn or the roving gets doubled into each other. And that's how the blending happens. It goes through the machines 3 times to make sure that the blends are not a spot here and a spot there. Our cotton is kind of a different product. The cotton itself is blended in another mill, and then we get a very, very, very fine fiber, and then we twist that together or ply that together to create our cotton fine or cotton fleece, which is our fingering weight or our worsted weight of yarn. So, if you live in warmer climates, that's a great product to use for a multitude of things. I know weavers. I know my wife loves weaving with cotton fine because it creates really nice hand towels. My house, we don't really ever use store-bought hand towels. They're all woven. So, which is pretty neat.
They work a lot better too.
Yes, they stay together nice, and they were woven with love.
And I remember when I was first starting to knit, which was about 25 years ago, that Lamb's Pride and Nature Spun were things that were just absolutely, go-to. At that point, there were a lot of people doing felting, so it was a very popular yarn for that too. But, having something that you can count on year after year, in some ways, it must be kind of difficult to maintain that consistency at the same time that the weather changes. Maybe the wool supply changes, maybe the scouring mill changes. How do you kind of maintain that steadiness? Yeah,
so a lot of that comes down to the main thing that we are concerned with in consistency, because we can keep the size of the fiber or the size of the yarn fairly consistent year after year, because wool it's different, and we test every single time we run a lot of yarn. It gets tested. We have books with recordings from the past 15 years. So we go back and test what we just made to what it has been in the past. But then the other problem is the dyeing. The dyeing is the hardest part to keep consistent, because not only does the wool change, the slight variation, wool's natural, of the color of the base product, but dyes change or dyes get discontinued or all those things. So we have filing cabinets upon filing cabinets full of 6-inch samples of every dye lot that we've ever dyed of a certain color. And that is compared every single time. That is the one thing we do keep consistent. You were mentioning that Lamb's Pride has always been kind of this base that everybody kind of learned on, or if you have a yarn stash, I really hope you have Lamb's Pride or some of our yarn that people can kind of count on to be consistent. And I truly hope that people find it consistent.
And you also have, every once in a while, you certainly create some new yarns. I was thinking about...
Well, our recent new yarn is Harborside Aran weight that we created, which was an Aran weight. We're actually, this is a little bit of a teaser. We're going to release a very one-off here within the next couple months direct to customers, which is a 4-ply. It's pretty much taking 4 plies of lamb's pride worsted and plying them together.
Oh, that sounds very, very chunky.
Very chunky. There's mistakes that get made in spinning of yarn, and we try to not make the mistakes cost us. So a lot of the time we create one-offs. So over the past couple of years, there's been some desire for very thick. A couple of years ago, the hand knitting was a big deal, where people were taking roving and knitting with their arms. Arm knitting.
Yeah.
And so this is kind of something similar with big needles. I mean, 1-inch needles, almost broomstick handles, but something different. It's going to be called Lamb's Pride Quartet because it's a 4-ply of Lamb's Pride. So hopefully, if listeners kind of look for that, if that's something that they're interested in.
It would hold up a heck of a lot better than those arm knitted blankets made out of just plain roving, which have no twist or anything like that.
No twist, and they pill like crazy.
Yeah, by the time you finish them. That Harborside was the yarn that was used in our most recent special issue for something called the Chore Jacket. And the designer, Mary Lou Egan, really liked using that yarn. And it says here that one is a Columbia and Rambouillet wool. Is that a different grade than some of the other yarns?
No, it's very similar than the other grades.
Okay.
We really buy 2 different grades of wool. We buy kind of a coarser fiber that we use in our top of the lamb, which is the main market for that is the Navajo weavers in the South. That kind of goes back to the history of this mill. Was some of the first yarn that was sold out of here was to the weavers down in the Four Corners region.
Okay.
We have a couple other grades of wool as you're kind of going up into the finer fibers, our nature spawn. And then we have a superwash line, our stratosphere.
I was going to ask you about the yarns for the Navajo or the Dene weavers. How did that come to be? It sounds like it's something that has been a long relationship.
Yes. So as the story went, my grandfather, after his kind of, I wouldn't call failed, but his first sales trip through Wyoming and South Dakota and Colorado, people were kind of like, where's this yarn coming from anyways? He went down to the South in probably his old Buick and had a full trunk load full of wool. And he went into a trading post and all the weavers came out. In about 15 minutes, all the yarn was gone. And he came, and I remember asking him how that might have felt. And he's like, oh, it was awesome. And he drove right back home and filled it back up and came back. So we have a relationship with a lot of different trading posts down there that buy our wool for the weavers. One of them is called Adopt a Native Elder, which I believe is a nonprofit that is kind of supplying yarn to elder weavers to supply the artists.
And then I think that they also facilitate selling the finished tapestries and rugs as well. So they kind of help with both the supplying and the marketing.
Yes.
So,
and if you've never ever been around a Navajo rug, a true Navajo rug, they're gorgeous. They're normally all in natural colors and they're very intricate, and they're not made on a floor loom. They're made on a tapestry loom. We had a class once here at our fiber school for that, and I watched them for a little bit, and I was like, pretty amazing.
I never did meet your grandfather, but he does sound like a character, and I'm sure you've heard this story and will probably correct me, but your mom told me a story about how one time he convinced her that she should take care of the lambs and that she should help with the Easter lambs. And she said, okay, I'll do that. And she didn't realize that this was going to involve lambing in the middle of December and January. And so that whole year she did that. And after that, she said, thank you, I pass.
Yes. My grandfather went through a lot of different iterations of lamb growing.
Mm-hmm.
There's having a feedlot of lambs, feeding out the lamb for the meat market, and then also the ewe lamb operation. And he decided to have 1,000 ewes, and they should all start lambing on Christmas. And if anybody's been out in the weather in December in western Nebraska, it can be very variable. It can be a beautiful 40-degree day, or this year I helped the neighbor feed and water some cows. It can be -20 very easily.
So with all of that going on, what's the next thing? What are you excited about? What's coming through your door?
Over the past year, we've been trying to develop the ability to dye top roving in smaller amounts. We have always been able to dye larger amounts of top to create our heathers, our blacks, our browns, our coppers, to create some of our wonderful heathers that you know in our Lamb's Pride line and Nature Spun line. But last year, we installed a new machine that gives us the ability to dye roving in small amounts. I mean, 80 pounds at a time and not 200 pounds. And so we have been trying to develop, first of all, what started was we developed 4 kits, needle felting kits that are a 2-dimensional needle felting. There has been lots of kits out there for 3-dimensional animals and things like that. We had an artist create a sketch of 4 different scenes, mountain scenes, river streams, and then we dyed about 16 different colors that go in there. And it's a very good project for, well, anybody who enjoys fiber, but also for the people that haven't learned how to knit. That's a good intro into needle felting. And so you can find those hopefully at a local yarn shop or directly from us. That's kind of a neat, fascinating project that we have.
Another kind of yarn that I know what my colleagues at Piecework particularly like, you folks do some wool embroidery yarns, is that right?
Yes. 25 years ago, there was a long-standing brand called Waverly Wools, which created needle felting yarn or embroidery. And we purchased the brand name about 25 years ago and all the colors that go along. And so we now supply needle felting yarn, which is actually becoming a larger part of our business. Some of the wool embroidery yarns have kind of gone out of business. Now we offer about 450 colors and all the hues that you possibly could need for our needle pointing needs.
Needle point, and I'm also seeing it for punch needle as well.
Yes, rug hooking and things like that. So, yeah, related. different terminology for that.
They're all kind of related to painting with yarn, painting with wool.
It's kind of color by number.
Yeah, fun and satisfying. So, Andrew, I know that it being a family business, you and Brittany kind of pinch hit. So are you going to go relieve her in taking care of Walter and his brother? And may I speak with the designer in the family?
Yes, we will get my wife on, Brittany. She is excited to talk to you, and I will go and manage my 5 and 2-year-old at this point. So Great. Thank you very much, Anne, for having me. And it was a joy to talk to you.
You as well. Brittany, thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me. I've never been on a podcast before, so I'm very excited.
I was just speaking with Andrew, and you guys did your pass the baton. You traded off, so.
Yes, we have our 2 kiddos. We live right next to the mill here, so it's pretty easy to trade off. So we're thankful to be able to do that.
Yeah, the beauty of a family business. Did you ever dream when you walked in the door for a tour that you would one day be living right next to it?
Yeah, I absolutely did not imagine that would happen. The baby you and Andrew talked about the story there, how we met. But yep, I just came to the mill for a tour. Yep. Never thought anything more would come of it than just learning about the yarn. But here I am 10 years later. So
you were somebody who already liked yarn. It's not like you were going to tour the widget factory. This was something you were interested in.
Yeah, I had gotten into knitting in college. That was kind of my friend group in college, was the knitting club. And so I had learned, and I had actually taught my mom how to knit. And she and I had really gotten into it together, and we would go on all different kinds of knitting trips. So we thought, let's go check out Brown Sheep Company and see what it's all about. And we did. We loved the tour. Yeah.
Yeah, just down the road.
Yep. I was in Nebraska. I was in a different part of the state, but it was not too far from where I was at the time. So yeah, we enjoyed it very much.
So I mostly know you now as a weaver. How did you get into weaving? You mentioned you started as a knitter. How'd you make the switch?
Yeah, so I didn't start weaving until after I had gotten married and we had moved here and become part of the business. And I'm trying to think. We took a class over at Shuttle Spindles and Skeins, which is a wonderful weaving shop over in Boulder, Colorado. My mom and I went and took a class together. It was a weekend class, and we were instantly just kind of addicted to weaving. I have a background in math, and so something about the combination of the colors and the logic, but also the creativity, all those different elements of weaving, those just kind of clicked for me. And I thought, this is my thing. Always going to love knitting, but weaving is just the thing that I enjoy the most when it comes to yarn. There's so many different things you can do with it. It can be simple, it can be complicated, so many different kinds of designs. So I really enjoy it.
I learned to weave at Shuttles as well. It's
Oh, cool.
no longer a store, but I believe Judy is still teaching folks to weave. So
yeah, I think they still have a community along with it. I'm sure thankful for Judy and all the knowledge that she has shared with so many weavers.
And you've designed for both little looms and handwoven at this point. So
I have
you've designed things at a larger gauge that are more typically associated with knitting yarns and things that are on a floor loom.
Right. At the stage of life I'm in right now, we have 2 young kids. And so the little looms are kind of working for my lifestyle a little bit better right now. Mm-hmm. It's just the rigid heddle loom you can warp up in an hour and you can have your project going in no time. And that's working a little bit better for me right now. So I've been enjoying going in that direction a little bit more. And then I think in other stages of life, I'll go back to more complex weaving on the floor loom.
Do you have a favorite yarn and or a favorite project?
I really like our cotton fleece yarn. So we have cotton fleece and cotton fine. Those are 2 different weights of our yarn that's 80% cotton and 20% wool. So it mostly feels like cotton, but it has a little bit of wool in it, which makes it a little bit stretchier, a little bit warmer. I really like to weave that into baby blankets. That's one of my favorite things. It makes such a great gift, a hand-woven baby blanket. And you can make it as simple or as complex as you want to, but those are some of my favorite projects that I've made.
You had a set of towels that I really enjoyed, I think, right?
Yes. I have done a couple blogs about hand-woven towels with cotton fine. Those just turn out so nice. They feel so good, and they're easy to wash and easy to care for. I love the wool, too, but the wool is a little bit more particular about how you take care of it.
Okay.
But the wool has its own special qualities, too. So I love all the yarns, really.
You basically live in a yarn store. It's
yeah.
You get to pick any color.
Yeah, it's pretty handy. It's pretty nice if you're trying to create something and you think, oh, I might want a slightly different shade. I wonder what that would be like. And then you can just hop on over to the inventory where there's hundreds of colors and you can grab a few options and you can try them out. And that makes it pretty easy to be creative when you have all those different colors and weights and everything just available.
Do you ever make special requests?
Sometimes I've gotten to help choose the colors. It's a challenge because you have to not only choose the colors that you like, but, try to decide what colors customers would like, whether they're weavers, knitters, crocheters, different ages, people that live in different parts of the country. You have to kind of try to guess what colors they might like. It's always easy to know which colors I like or which colors I think are missing from the lineup, but you have to kind of balance that with what you think people are looking for.
Well, that is a trade-off because on the other hand, you have good taste and I hope that you've got lots of great feedback for your good taste. So what you like does have something to do with it.
Right. I like to think so. But sometimes it's fun to think of different combinations of yarns that could be put together. We have our heathered yarns, which are the ones that's kind of like a fleck of dark mixed in with the light. It's blended in. And then a lot of times we dye colors over the top of that heathered base. And so that's kind of one of my favorite things to suggest for new colors is like, oh, what if we tried this light yellow over the top and it's going to turn out like a deep gold or something like that. Just kind of experimenting with different combinations of things that maybe the mill already has perfected, the process, but just doing them in a little bit different way.
So how is it kind of different than what you imagined going from the consumer side of yarn manufacturer to being on the maker side? Well, I was going to say on the maker side, we usually think of makers as people who make things with wool.
Right.
But making the yarn of making it. Yeah.
Yeah. So, there's just so many different steps of the process. There's so many different challenges that can come up. Okay. For example, if we have a really consistent color that's a popular one and everybody loves it, but sometimes, one of the ingredients in that dye is all of a sudden not available. Well, then you've got to figure out how to reformulate the whole dye recipe with new ingredients, or you've got to maybe get rid of that color and come up with a new one that would sort of fill that spot. So there's so many little things like that can happen in the process. But then again, there's a lot of sort of mistakes that can happen in the process that actually turn into a really beautiful yarn. So there's quite a few of the yarns that Brown Sheep makes that started out as maybe a bit of a mistake. Maybe something went wrong with the process or the dye, and the result was something really special. And they decided, well, let's keep doing that. Let's repeat that mistake and make that a regular product. So I guess that's kind of a mix of good and bad, all the different variables that can happen in the spinning, the dyeing.
So speaking of playing with different colors, one of the things I know that you did was to create a tartan and actually register a tartan.
Yeah.
Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, that was one of the first things that I ever had designed. And it was just a local group decided to put together a Celtic gathering here in our community. We're in Scotts Bluff, Nebraska. And they wanted to tie in a bunch of elements of the history here. And so they had an idea, but they didn't know anything about weaving. But they wanted to tie in the fact that we have a wool mill here in Nebraska. And so we're known for Scotts Bluff National Monument. That's our landmark. That's right here in our county. So we wanted to tie in sort of the colors and the history of Hiram Scott, who was an explorer who had some unfortunate events occur at Scotts Bluff, and it was named after him. Unfortunately, he actually died right at Scotts Bluff Monument, so kind of a sad piece of history, but it was named after him. So his family tartan had been purple, so we included some purple, and then we included some of the other colors, like Nebraska's state bird is the meadowlark, and then some of the other colors reflect other parts of Nebraska. I think we even did some red for the Huskers, of course. So we just incorporated a bunch of different elements that sort of make Scotts Bluff County unique, and then I got to weave up some samples, and then a whole group of weavers actually came to our festival and they followed the pattern and they produced a whole bunch of the tartan. So just kind of a neat thing to be part of.
Yeah. I remember there being a presentation of it. That was so cool.
Yeah, it was. It's a very official. There's so many tartans registered, for all different locations. And it's a really cool piece of history. So
one of the things I've noticed over the years is that once upon a time, wool used to be the primary fiber yarn that weavers were using. And when I was speaking with Linda Ligon, who was the first editor of Handwoven, she was really surprised when I told her many weavers these days just use cotton and pretty much never use wool. So can you talk a little bit about weaving with wool? What do you like about working with wool?
Yeah, I wonder if maybe it's a little bit intimidating just because we are not as familiar with wool as we used to be, even just for our clothing, things like that. Everything's kind of shifted towards cotton and polyester and different fibers. But there's a lot of things to love about wool. It's really an amazing natural fiber. For one thing, just the colors, the way that it picks up color is so vibrant. It's a lot more vibrant than cotton. It's, as far as I know, it's more vibrant than any other fiber. Just kind of the depth of the color, and you kind of just have to see it and just recognize it is just beautiful. So that's an element about wool. And then there's so many things to it. It's very strong, but it's also kind of stretchy. So it can be a little bit tricky. If you're using wool as a warp, it's a lot more likely to have a little bit of stretch or maybe even have a little bit of abrasion if you have too much tension on it. So you want to, treat it a little bit more delicately than you would with a cotton. You don't want to get your warp tension too tightly, things like that. Or maybe you want to just use a wool weft, do kind of a weft-faced weave. That way you can enjoy the colors and use a cotton or a linen or something a little bit stronger as the warp. But there's so many beautiful colors to bring together. And then you can also felt the finished product, which is one of those, if you want your product to be felted, that can be a wonderful result. If you weren't planning on it, if you accidentally, set it too close to the washing machine and it falls in, which I've done before, then you end up with something that's tiny and not at all what you wanted it to be. So
well, I was going to ask you about that because one of the projects I know you did was a table runner and trivet set. And I'll put a picture of that in our show notes. But you used the unfold fabric for the runner and you fold it to be a nice protective trivet. So kind of playing with the different properties.
Yeah, I thought it would be fun to kind of show the difference of you start with the same piece of weaving and cut it into a few different pieces. And so the table runner was just hand washed and then the trivets were fold. And so they shrink down and they're completely different texture. And they feel and look different, but they also still coordinate with the other piece. So it's almost like a science experiment. If you haven't done that before, it's just kind of a fun little experiment to try. and see how it turns out and just kind of be amazed at the properties of wool and the fact that it does that on its own with just a little help from warm water and soap.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool.
So you mentioned that you have a math background. Do you have an art background, or do you have any training that gives you this creativity in your design, or is it just inspiration from what you see around you?
I really don't. I don't have any art background at all. I found myself drawn to a lot of creative people in my life. A lot of my good friends over time have been artists and really creative people. So I've gotten a lot of influence from my friends. But as far as that goes, no, I don't have any background. I enjoy reading magazines, and I spend a lot of time outside and in nature. And so I find a lot of inspiration from those things and kind of use the math maybe to help pull it together and kind of formulate it into something that makes sense. So,
well, I mean, math is natural as well. So that makes sense that those fit together.
Yeah, it is.
So if you were somebody who was just kind of getting started with weaving with wool, what would you recommend?
I would say there's a lot of really beautiful colors of wool. You could choose a multicolored, or you could just choose some colors you like and maybe just do a plain weave on a rigid heddle loom. And you could use a heavier weight, maybe like a worsted weight or something that's not going to take a lot of time. And I think people, especially that have gone from knitting into weaving, are just amazed by how much more quickly you can make something. You could weave up a scarf in 1 or 2 days. And that's really satisfying if you're a knitter and you're used to it taking maybe a couple weeks to knit up a scarf. And so it's really fun to be able to see a project come together so quickly with just a simple loom like a rigid heddle.
You know, I remember I walked into Shuttles actually one day saying I need to knit a shawl for a friend's wedding. And I remember Judy looked at me and she said, "You do know that if you weave it, you will be finished, in the next 2 days, right?"
Right. Even if you use really fine, lightweight yarn, you can still weave it much more quickly than you can knit. No.
But I'm just looking at a beautiful also set of birch-inspired placemats that you made as well.
Mm-hmm.
So
another inspiration drawn from nature. Mm-hmm. That's kind of my go-to, is think about what things I find beautiful and then think, how could I make a pattern that would reflect that, if not copy it exactly, because weaving is going to be symmetrical and it's going to be repetitive, and nature is not really like that, but it's fun to try to sort of capture a little bit of what it looks like.
But you also made a very brightly colored blanket not that long ago, right? It was meant to have a sort of a sensory experience, something in a whole bunch of brights.
Yeah, that one was kind of meant to just light up a room. Anyway, it was made for a niece of mine that has a lot of medical issues. And so I wanted to create something. Her family's made her a special room. Yeah, just kind of for different sensory experiences. And I wanted that blanket to just be like kind of a happy little ray of sunshine for her room, just to kind of cheer everybody up if they were having a hard day or whatever it might be. So I chose one of our multicolored yarns that was pinks and yellows, and not really colors that I would usually choose for myself, but for a little girl, I thought they were just happy and bright.
I just love this sort of inspiration about sort of finding yourself in a place where you can use all of these materials and what you see around you and really kind of exploring and building.
Yeah, and there's so many different directions to go with it. And sometimes, there's a special person that you think, how could I create something that would really let this person know that I care about them? And I think a lot of weavers and knitters are inspired by that. There's a special purpose that I want to make something for. Or maybe it's the yarn itself. Maybe you think, oh, this is a really amazing color, or whatever it might be. What can I make that would really make this even more beautiful as a finished product? So there's a lot of different starting points, I think, when it comes to creating something. And it's really pretty cool in Western Nebraska. We have some nice scenery and wide open spaces, and it seems boring, but it's pretty neat.
She's on the other side of the state, but one of our previous guests, Mary Zickafus, is also in Nebraska, and it just talks about how incredibly inspired she is by the landscape around her. So I'm not surprised.
Yeah, Nebraska has a lot of beauty to it. Mm-hmm. It's just a little bit of a hidden gem. Not everyone appreciates it, but that's okay. We do.
Well, we can all appreciate the yarn that comes from it. So
right. Yes.
That I don't have to drive across the state to get to enjoy the yarn.
Yeah.
So I think it's actually really cool that you can go and take a tour of the mill. Do you ask people to call ahead?
Yes. So we do, just because we never quite know where production is going to be on a given day. The best time to take a tour is going to be in the morning. The mill gets pretty warm, especially in the summer in the afternoon. So most of our production is shutting down by early afternoon just to get the employees out of the heat of the mill. We're not offering tours on a regular basis. We have at times in the past, but right now it's just kind of by request. So give us a call ahead at our office. Make sure it's a day when somebody's there that can walk you around. Otherwise, we have our little outlet shop here where we sell seconds, yarns that have maybe a slight flaw to them, but they're still good yarn. And so there's a lot to see if you do come here. And sometimes we feel like we're the only ones who are actually making the yarn in the U.S. There are some others. There are some other producers in the U.S., but there aren't very many. And we're one of the few companies that's really making the yarn from start to finish. We're here in, rural America. We're pretty far away geographically from most of our customers. Our local customer base is really small. We're sending our yarn out to different parts of the country and all over the world sometimes. And we kind of similar companies to us are typically having their yarn made or manufactured somewhere else. And then they're putting all their energy into marketing the yarn. And we're sort of just the opposite. We're putting all of our time and energy into making the yarn and making sure our employees are all taken care of, throughout all the different processes, and making sure that, each skein has the right number of, doesn't have too many knots or doesn't have slubs, or, our dye lots are consistent, things like that. And so just kind of getting the word out to customers that we are manufacturing yarn right here in the middle of the United States. And I think people are sometimes surprised to learn that.
I think so too. And I think it also is related to the fact that there's a tradition in this sort of middle of the country to let your work speak for itself, to have a certain personal modesty that I think can be kind of challenging when it's time to sort of stand up and shout about what you do.
Right, exactly. And we're here in the Midwest where it is just more of a modest culture where we're just, we're surrounded by farmers and they're out working in their fields and we're right next to them. We're making our yarn, and we're not at a lot of the, big shows where there's a lot of exposure to our product. We don't have as many ways to get our product kind of in front of people. The whole world has really changed a lot,
right,
as far as how people are getting their hands on products. And we really want people to keep going to their local yarn shops. And we have always felt that that's the heart and soul of the handcrafting industry, is those yarn shop owners who are teaching people how to knit, teaching people how to weave. And we can do as much, with the internet as we can, but it's never going to replace those person-to-person connections, because I think that's how all handcrafts are passed on.
One thing about having a business that's been very established is that people don't necessarily know, is Brown Sheep a big company? Is Brown Sheep a small company? It's not one indie dyer with 10 sheep, but it's also not a huge factory where nobody ever touches the yarn. It's this sort of, a scale where you can make something that people can count on, that can provide good jobs for folks and make sure that people have great yarn.
Yeah. We're at a very unique point in the market where there's other textile mills that we hear of that are running 24/7. They just keep replacing whoever's running that machine, and they do shifts and they keep working 24 hours. And we are not like that. Our employees drive in early in the morning and they leave in the afternoon, and we wave at each individual person as they leave. And if a customer calls and they have a problem with one skein of one dye lot, we can answer the phone and we can walk out to that box and inventory where it came from, and we can probably try to figure out what happened. And so we're small enough that we can have that personal connection, and we really want to have that. That's really important to us. But at the same time, we're also big enough that we can do large scale orders, and we're shipping to all different parts of the U.S. And for the most part, people are pretty familiar with Brown Sheep Company. A lot of people learn to knit using our yarns, or it's part of their crafting history in one way or another.
Yeah. What was it like for you? I mean, we talked a little bit about, getting to have all the yarn that you want, but unlike Andrew, you weren't raised pushing a broom in the mill from the time you were 12. What was it like to step into being part of this manufacturing family?
Yeah, well, it was just amazing at first. If you haven't been to our mill before, and you're a knitter and you like yarn, when you first walk in and you're just surrounded by boxes and boxes of all these different colors of yarn, and it's spinning around. It's, on the spindles, and it's being spun, and it's being twisted in the skeins, and it's kind of that initial amazement was just really neat. And I would highly recommend, if anybody is traveling through the area, just stop by and we'd take you around and you can see how the yarn is made. Just seeing that process and all the colors is kind of that initial, wow, yeah, this is really cool. And then over time, it just kind of becomes your normal life. But then I think you appreciate more of the fine details about each yarn, or you kind of perfect which yarn you think is best for different purposes or different uses. And it's fun to be able to talk to crafters about, oh, this is the exact thing you want to make. Here's what I think would be the perfect yarn for you to use for that project, or being able to make the suggestions, because we do have so many different weights of yarn, so many different colors. Really, I think there's a yarn for every project that you might be able to dream up. I think we could find something in our mill that would be perfect for it. So
I love the fact that you have different put-ups and that weavers can get the yarn on cones, which is not all that common, especially for wool. There's a couple of folks who do it, but it's not all that common.
Yes, so handy. And we talked about special requests. That's something that I've occasionally requested is, I want to weave up a bunch of lamb's pride, and I can take it over to the machine where they put the yarn on cones. Would you just move some of this yarn over some cones for me so I don't have to mess with taking it off the skeins? Because that's awesome. So much handier.
It's true. Well, Brittany, thank you so much for talking to me about your work. I can't wait to see what comes off the machines and also what kind of designs you come up with next.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I always appreciate all the magazines and all the content that you guys put out. It's just wonderful and inspiring.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for listening to the Long Thread Podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please rate the show and leave us a comment on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. Thanks again.